So in this video, I'll talk about the pros and cons of a few different qualitative methods and tell you about what the good and bad reasons are for choosing between them.
I'm mapping basic topics of conversation.
Completely different pictures.
So here's our problem. Individual interviewing is very time-consuming, not least because of how long it takes to transcribe the interviews. You could address that problem by using an alternative method that might save you some time and hopefully save you a bit of money. And the reason we often want to save a bit of money is to make our research more competitive for funding. So we can convince a funder that we can do more with less. And that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why sometimes people use group interviews rather than individual interviews. Now here, in a group interview, you've got multiple participants being interviewed at the same time, in a group. And the most popular type of group interview is the focus group interview. So focus groups really became popular in the 1990s. And one of the key texts at that time was David Morgan's book called Successful Focus Groups, Advancing the State of the Art. This one here, if I'm pointing in the right place. Now, at that time, focus groups were seen as quite innovative, but they had been used for quite a while in the field of marketing. They've been used in the field of marketing for decades, prior to them being adopted in the social sciences. Actually, a lot of qualitative methods have either come from marketing or have been developed in marketing. Interesting little fact for you. Now, the focus group is a type of group interview where the interaction between participants in the group is the thing that you are most interested in. And the size of the group is usually somewhere between 5 to 8 people. Now, you would have thought that interviewing 5 to 8 people in one go would save you time. But it costs you time in some ways because it takes more time in planning the group, coordinating everyone. You have to get all of those people in the same room at the same time. There's less transcribing to do, but it can still be quite hard doing the transcription. Actually, it can be harder than an individual interview. It's harder to capture good quality audio in a group setting. Harder to do that in a group setting than in an individual setting, unless you can mic up each person in the group. So you can run into those problems with transcription when you have poor quality audio. And poor quality audio is more likely when you're interviewing a group. But there are other drawbacks to group interviewing. For one, you're not going to be able to go into depth into each participant's thoughts, feelings, and experiences because each participant gets less time to speak than in an individual interview. It's also harder to manage consent because a participant might be quiet for quite a lot of the interview. So are they still happy being involved in the interview, or are they just listening? Quite happily sitting there quietly listening to what other people are saying. In an individual interview, if your participant isn't speaking, that could be a sign that they're withdrawing their consent. They don't want to be involved in the interview. But if someone's quiet in a group discussion, it's harder to read them in relation to whether they're signaling that they don't want to be there. Maybe they're just listening. It's also hard to create a safe out for someone. It's hard leaving a group discussion without causing some level of embarrassment to someone. And you can't ordinarily stop a group discussion just because one person doesn't appear to be too happy about being there. Unless it's something really serious, then you can stop the discussion. But you can't really just stop everything because one person doesn't appear to want to participate. Also, it's harder managing confidentiality and personal disclosure. The group has to agree to keep things confidential as a group. And the other thing is that because it's a much more social event, you have a longer startup time. And you also have to account for some people arriving a bit late. And you have to provide catering, or ordinarily you have to provide some catering because that's an expectation when people meet socially, and that's what they're doing for a focus group. They're meeting socially. It's also harder to break the ice with a group and engage in small talk. So all that sort of stuff, it's the social dynamics. The social dynamics are generally much more complicated for a group than for a one-to-one interview. But that does make it a fascinating method, because the real benefit of the focus group is that you get to hear how people talk about an issue with other people, how things are discussed in a social rather than a private setting. Now, focus groups still have that problem of you having to convert speech to text, which is expensive and it's hard to do, the transcription. So why not just go straight for text? Cut out the talking. So rather than talk to people, why don't you ask people to write down their thoughts and feelings, like keeping a journal, or run a survey where you ask questions, but they are open questions where participants can write longer responses rather than just tick a box on a scale, a more qualitative survey. Or you could do analysis on documents that have already been written. And that last method is called document analysis. Now, all of those methods are certainly cheaper. There's no time spent arranging interviews or traveling to interviews, running interviews, and there's no transcription needed. The text has already been written for you. But there is a problem with these sorts of methods. It's hard to get people to engage with the sort of methods where you're asking people to write down something for your research, like keeping a diary or completing a more extensive survey. For one, it places the time burden on the participant, and because your method becomes quite time-consuming for the participant, it's hard to keep them engaged. People drop out more easily and more quickly from that sort of research where you're asking them to do a bit of writing for you. How do you fix that problem? Well, you could just look for documents that people have already written. And this could be letters people have written, notes that people have written about something, or documents that an organization has produced, such as reports, working papers, and so on. And those written documents is what we call the grey literature, which just means it's text that's not wholly public, or maybe not public at all, or slightly public in terms of it's been distributed to people, but it's a limited distribution. It sits outside of commercial and academic publishing. But that makes those documents harder to access. The accessibility of the documents does vary. Some of that grey literature is published and available to the public, such as policy documents from government, press statements, or annual reports from organizations. And some public institutions are required to keep minutes of meetings public to make them publicly accessible because those organizations are accountable to the public. So for those documents, you don't really need permission to access the documents, but you do need someone to help you get there sometimes, to get you to the document. So access is not such a problem because they are supposed to be public documents. But the access does get harder when the document isn't intended for broad public release. And you can also use freedom of information filings in some countries, like Australia, to get your hands on the documents that organizations want to keep private, if you can make a good argument in relation to why those documents should be made public. But let's not get into that, because that's hard stuff. But we also have social media. Social media is another place where people have written stuff down, and we could get access to that. That's broadly public stuff. And more people are publishing their thoughts and feelings and experiences on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. But those are generally short pieces of texts, and the companies who own these platforms, they're commercial companies, so companies like Facebook, they can fiercely defend the use of the material that's posted on their platforms, particularly if that material is going to profit you in some way or could interfere with the profits of their company. So you have to be pretty careful with that stuff. It's not as public as you might think it is. But you could also move completely away from text. And you can actually do an analysis of images. So it solves the problem of no transcription again. So you just access images. We have methods called photo voice, where you ask people to take pictures of things that they think might help you understand their experiences or their thoughts or views on a particular issue. But we won't get into that method, but I just wanted to mention that it's an alternative that avoids that problem of transcription, and is not text-based, but is image-based. And more research is using methods like that. Now, these methods are less time-consuming in terms of there being no transcription, but there is often additional time in getting permission to access the documents. And sometimes people or organizations can be quite sniffy about releasing documents, can be quite reluctant giving you access to things that have been written down. And there's an interesting reason for this, and that's tied to the big trade-off with using these types of methods that use text that has already been produced. So with document analysis in general, you have access to the words that someone has written, but it's not a two-way conversation. You can't ask the writer what they meant when they wrote a particular thing. And that's a problem because a written text is stripped of context. And that's a big problem when you're using documents that were not written for you, like documents written for a reason other than for your research project. You might not know who wrote the document, who edited the document, who the intended audience was for the document, which is not always obvious. It's not always a simple question, that one. You also don't know what constraints the document was written under, such as legal constraints, remembering that can be really risky for people and organizations to put things in writing. So often there's an eye on the legal issues when someone's putting down thoughts on paper, particularly a large corporation. They're very careful about what they write. So there's a lot of guesswork that comes in when you try, as you should, to fill in those blanks and understand how that document is being produced and why it's being produced. This also means that the person or organization that wrote the document doesn't get to explain it to you because there isn't that two-way conversation. And that's a key reason why they might not be that keen on you getting access to the document. Of course, you can set up meetings where you talk through how you've made sense of the document, so the person who wrote it or owns the document can have a say in how you interpret it. You know, they can say, well, no, I think you're wrong on your interpretation here. But of course, that pulled you back to interviewing. And again, your method becomes quite costly in terms of time and money, because then you're back to that problem of setting up interviews and all the costs involved in it, not least transcription. And you were trying to get away from transcription. But if you are less interested in why someone or why some organization wrote something, and you're more interested in the ways things are written and how those written documents might represent more general ways certain issues are discussed and represented to other people, then those problems are not really methodological problems. You know, that fact that you can't have that conversation with the author. They're problems related to trust and related to consent, getting permission to access the documents and use those documents in your research. But in their favor, document analysis, when you're doing analysis on text that's already been produced or you're asking people to produce for you, it's cheaper than interviewing people. But there's a big but. This is a big but when it comes to doing that analysis of documents. Because when it comes down to it, you actually shouldn't be choosing your method based on cost. That's a really bad way of choosing a method. So here, I've landed you to this place where I said, look, there's this method you could use that wipes out all the transcription costs. It's really quick and easy and cheap. And now I'm telling you, now I've led you down that track, I'm telling you that's a bad place to go to if you're trying to find a reason for choosing a method. What you should be doing, and the clue's been there all along in these videos, what you should be doing is choose the method that has the greatest fidelity to your research question. The best method to answer your research question. And it's that thing, the research question, the thing I've been promising I'll tell you about, which I've not quite told you about yet, and I'm still not telling you about it because I'm going to tell you about it in the next video. So it's nearly there. We're nearly there. I told you we'd get there. We're nearly there. So just watch the next video and I'll get you there, because the research question becomes critical in deciding what method we should use. And in the next video, which is going to be the last one for our unit for level 2, I'll also tell you about one of psychology's biggest problems when it comes to research. The problem that's called methodolatry. So, till then, ta-da.